Alright, again my friends, this is a Batman GM bringing you my revisitation and or review of various older game systems that I have in possession that may or may not have on your shelves or may not have seen. This is the Wilderness Survival Guide by Kim Han. I have done a lot of stuff on rules that are easily commonly discarded and no longer vogue. Things like encumbrance, subsistence, travel, and using weather. And a lot of that information is packaged in a very nicely defined and easily readable set of concepts and conceptual rules in this particular book. Now, the book itself. This book itself I got a little bit of debate from a couple people, because when I sit there and tell them, oh, it's the second edition, I misstated that, but I wasn't correct in my statement, but it was also correct in its intent, because this is a second release, if you will. The original stuff, this is from 86 or 87. That's in fact, I know I stated that before. 1986, year after I graduated high school. And when I was in my late teens, when I was 14, 13 years old, I started buying the original AD&D books that came out. They had a completely different set of looks. They were much older. They were dark brown. They had the GM guide had the demonic red demon guy on it, the cauldron, and so on and so forth. And at some point, most of us are familiar with the legendary white books, which I never had access to. I personally never did. My friend Gilson's brother had a set, but we played his basic, the red set, when they first came out, and I bought my own box red set and my own blue red set, which I've either given away at some point in my past, maybe to one of my kids, or it disappeared during this a number of moves over the past X amount of years, or lost in storage. And after we cleaned out my parents' house, I never found them, so I don't know what happened to them. But they came out with the first set of hard books, which were AD&D, the Advanced Dungeons and Dragons system that began the journey of what we know from all the way up to current 5.0 and the approaching 6.0, which is in the works. Where things start to get a little dodgy, it wasn't until the late 80s, early 90s that this idea of 0.0 whatevers, these actual designated upgrades or changes in design concepts started to come about. We just had the next new release. We didn't consider it in that venue. So technically speaking, this is from the Orange series that came out after the original series was come out. So when my mother got infected by the satanic panic in the real early 80s, we're talking 81-ish, 81, 80, 81, 82, and she went on a tangent and she burnt my core books. She burnt the original hard books that I had, and I had 6 or 7 of them, and a number of other modules and things. A lot of my early D&D modules were burnt at that time, and I never recovered those. I just chose not to rebuy those. I got more into creating my own modules, my own game campaigns, so I was more interested in this material and less interested in game modules. Now that changed when I got into Star Wars and when Forgotten Realms came out, but I wasn't collecting the modules for play. I was collecting them for reference material and for personal enjoyment. It's kind of hard to explain. So this makes this the second, amongst the second or third installments of first edition. So if you look at first edition AD&D, there's at least 2 or 3. I think there's 3, because I have another AD&D book that is not classified second edition. The official second edition would have been the 4th installment. So technically speaking, didn't that make that 4.0? This would be 2.0 or 3.0, and then the one that says second on it would be 4, and then the 3.0, and then the 3.5, and then 4, it would be 4.5, and then 5, and so the current would be 6.0 or 7.0. I mean, if you actually were, you know, quantifying them, that categorizing them in that method as we do today now. So that being said, there was some confusion about this, but this particular game system, this particular installment, of a lot of those early books, these are timeless in the aspect that while there are a few conversion chart or a few charts for using modifiers and bonuses and things like this, the bulk of the material here is not dice generated. It's not information that needs to be translated from version to version. The material in it is verbal and written, so it is easily to understand why weather works the way it does, or why encumbrance, or how encumbrance affects travel, and how so on and so forth. So like I said, I've done 4 videos on the most commonly discarded rules in our gaming hobby, and encumbrance, because GM Grumpy brought that up and it got me started onto it, and then of course substance, that we do a wink and a nod to worrying about our characters. It's just a given or assumed, and that's fine. There's no rules or role anywhere at any point, any place that says you should ever say how you must, you know, operate or play something. You play as you wish to play, and that's the best way for it to do. Yeah, like how this stuff explains why the book came about, how it came about. You know, there's that argument about too many rules, too many rules, too few rules, clunky, light, heavy, narrative, similarist. I don't know. I am struggling with this idea that somehow or another that they don't all walk hand in hand, and that maybe that's because I'm older and I grew up with what we grew up with, and I've been here since the beginning. You know, there's a lot of us have been here from the ride all along, and there's a bunch of younger people who've come along and joined in, and God bless you all. But at the same time, you don't. I pity some of the newest players in some aspects. Rob Gusterson brought that up in one of his videos recently about how perhaps we're not doing these players justice by minimizing everything the way we do, because we're taking away many of the little elements of what makes the adventuring game the adventure that it is. And that's just my personal opinion, and I'm sure somebody will want to try to torch me for it, but that's also, I noticed, the madness of the social media that we have today. So anyway, this particular book and its companion book, the Dungeoneer Survival Guide, are timeless in the aspect that they can cross all versions. You could pick this book up and use it in any standard fantasy role-playing game system with very little to have to worry about modifications. You don't need the modifiers for their pluses and stuff, which you're just looking at the base material and the conceptual stuff that's in it. So, you know, and it's easy for me to ramble on about it, and much harder for me to quantify it in such a manner that it makes a smooth sense, because there are people out there with much more articulated than this verbal concept that we have today of explaining how things work, and I'm not necessarily one of them. Yeah, see, for example, this is one of these things that will set many people off, going, oh, don't, how could you dare do that? Using these rules require both the DM Dungeons Master and the players in the campaign pay much more attention to details they before might have disregarded or passed over lightly. Players will have to be much more explicit about exactly what equipment their characters are packing, and may have to include things in their gear that were never considered important before. A tent doesn't just appear out of thin air when it's time to set up a camp. Everyone involved in the game, that's true. That's true. There's a lot of stuff we have a tendency to do a wink and a nod to, and then don't care about. And if that's how you play, then that's how you play. But there's a lot of things there that's being possibly missed. Lots of different kinds of things that could come up. Just knowing that you have it, just knowing I have 2 weeks worth of iron rations is important. If my character didn't bother to include 2 weeks worth of iron rations in their stuff, well then as a GM, I'm entitled to cause problems because they didn't consider that important enough. I'm not going to go for it. I'm sorry, as a GM, I'm not going to let you get by with it. We don't have to tick off every day's usage of it, but if you didn't invest in it, it's like I'm a big fan of the paying the service fee, if you will. So many gold pieces a month comes out of your stash, and that's going to replenish all those supplies. That way we don't have to worry about you having them unless things go real south. It's like a great part of this book is devoted to presenting rules and guidelines that translate the effects of a natural outdoor environment into game turns. How much damage does a character suffer from prolonged exposure to extremely hot or extremely cold temperatures? How do terrain, climate, weather conditions affect the character's ability to move and attack? The precautions most characters take to keep their mouse and pack animals, and themselves for that matter, in good physical condition. What happens if someone's standing nearby when a volcano erupts? How far can a character see on a clear day? No, the answer is not forever. The general intent of the Wilderness Survival Guide is to be faithful in the literal interpretation of the title. The natural physical environment is described in a fair amount of detail, along with the rules for how characters and creatures are affected in that environment. Yeah. See, I told you this. My first version predated this by some the inception of the AD&D game provided both rules for underground and above ground adventuring. The Monster Manual, which was released in '77, was the first of the hardbound AD&D rulebooks, including descriptions of creatures that inhabit the wilderness, in addition to creatures that are normally found only in darkness, recesses, subterranean caves. The only needs, it was one of the books my mom burned. As far as listing the Anhag is usually found in forest and choice agricultural land, I realize that despite its name, the scope of Advanced Dungeons and Dragons game is much larger than most expansive dungeon. Player's Handbook appeared several months later, so it would have been also in 1977. Introduced the Druid and the Ranger classes, various places outdoor. Then came the Dungeon Master's Guide, which would have been in '78. This would have been the one with the red demon on the cover. Entire section is a massive book. So I bought them in '77, '78. Would have been probably '78, '79. They probably would have come out, and then I started getting old to the point where I was able to get rides. It wasn't until '80 or '81 I could get regular rides to a game store. So I probably started purchasing them several years later, and then at some point my mother burned them in '80 or '81, and I bought an addition, a second set. There was another set that came out that does not have the orange cover, and I have the GM guide for that one somewhere. And then I started buying these when these came. I bought as they came out. It's always nice to see that kind of stuff. Definition terms, ability checks, kinds of temperature, proficiency checks. Yeah, same. Other parts of the book can only be used during adventures in the outdoor setting. Perhaps the most notable example is the system for weather determination. To give you an appendix at the end of this book, even if the action in your campaign consists of a succession of dungeon expeditions, players' characters have to spend at least some time on the surface as they travel from one dungeon entrance to the next. And as long as they have to make the trip, why not make it interesting for them? There you have it. Are we dominated by every single detailed role of every moment of every game day? No, you don't need to do that. The fact that you can incorporate these things, or the occasion when the player characters themselves go into some scenario of their own making, or they go off track and then they try to achieve a goal or to conquer an encounter or a challenge that wasn't preconceived by the GM, having to be able to tap on something like this to figure out, is there anything I can do to manipulate the environment or the situation, or how do they handle this, or what have you. It's nice to have that expanded set of rules or explanations, perhaps. I mean, we all toss this concept of rules around real easy. It's really easy to toss the rules around when they're not rules. They've never been rules. They've never been established as rules. They're really guidelines. They're guidelines to give you the information you may want to achieve or to thwart the achievement of a particular action and or challenge. It's just something to consider. So we got terrain, bodies of wilderness proficiencies. Yeah, you gotta share the table. We got things like many of these skills that were in the earliest versions and have long since been grouped together into catch-all skill sets, which I'm not necessarily disagreeing with. Fire building, for example, fishing, foraging, all these were original skills, and having them now as a survival skill, just makes it a little simpler. I'm not against that. Mountaineering, plant lore, just explain some of those. Running, sprinting. I've heard people say, well, running's not a skill. Really? It's not? But there's a big difference between running and sprinting. Let me explain that difference in here. If somebody who's a trained runner, who spends a portion of their day or their week repeatedly conditioning their body and their mind to that concept of pushing their endurance, pushing that boundary of what they can and can't do over time, I'm just saying, right? Dressing for the weather, dealing with weather, effects of exertion, clothing functions and armor, the effects of the environment, temperature and wind, temperature effects, wind velocities, special weather, hurricane damage, hailstorm damage to characters, damage from heat and cold, effects on equipment, effects on road, sand, dust, encumbrance and movement, encumbrance and movement for land-based animals, climbing, encumbrance while climbing, whole subsection on dealing with climbing, chances of falling, damage from falling, climbing checks. Now even here they set a maximum for fall damage. We know the standard was 1d6 per every 10 feet. So this here says 51 feet or more, 20d6 maximum. Rough slopes, climbing for movement, using rope for climbing, roping together, belaying, rappelling. That's something was a very common, still a common skill, is rope use. And so many people failed to remember just how many different uses for rope there are. Everything from tying knots and climbing a surface to actually mountaineering and lowering yourself up and down, lowering people and equipment, using ropes and sailing and other uses. Not everybody remembers everything the same way. So the rules like jumping, overland visibility, effects of moving water, diving and surfacing, especially with encumbrance, treading water, holding one's breath. Want to know what it takes for a person to hold their breath when they're not underwater? We got it explained here. movement in waterborne vehicles. This is a very nice chunk of chunky extra stuff, because when I used campaigns where people were using boats on rivers or using small sailboats, this was what came into play when I needed to find some information on it. Same went for flying mounts. There was a number of campaigns where players wanted to have flying creatures and having rules on operating in the air and moving around and so forth was nice to have. We get into food and water, subsistence, going without food, food gathering, foraging, minimum requirements, hunting, edible, inedible plants, hunting proficiency, fishing, finding water, where water is found, camping and campfires. How often we worry about that? We just set camp. We don't worry about all that stuff, right? And maybe the rough encounter, medicines and first aid, vision and visibility, natural hazards in the wilderness. One of my coworkers just drove the flatbed back in. Common rules for wilderness play. And this is running on 20 minutes, so I'm trying to keep less than a half hour. Mouse and beast of burden, magic in the wilderness, and how that's true. How a wilderness environment, the weather, things like that can affect how easy or how complicated the magic's going to be. Starting from scratch, creating your own campaign worlds. There's a nice section of things in here. And this is by no means the only book, because in a later version, in the official second edition version, they came out with a bunch of other books, the maroon, green, and blue backed supplement books and there's one or two of there, at least one I'm out of the ground up here in my overhead because I know I got it, that have additional or revised versions of what was in here. But this is a whole book mostly devoted to those rules that most commonly get discarded or ignored in most game campaigns, most GMs and players. That, to my personal knowledge, my personal experience, this doesn't hold true. You may not be one of those. You're probably more likely to find, like most of us, myself included, pointing my fingers at myself, at me, that I will make use of stuff when it's convenient for me, and then I'll ignore them when it's not, because that's kind of the gist of the value of this clunky, chunky system. And then there's that rough guy right there.
What the fuck?
What the fuck right there?
What are you doing?